Well, thank you. I'd first like to say thank you to the Graduate Student Division for inviting me to present. And I do need to clarify, I am a master's candidate, but I presently don't have a doctorate degree in any field of science. So take that for what it's worth. Wanted to get started this morning or this afternoon and talk a little bit about the topic that I've been asked to present, which is how to get your research noticed beyond the Journal of Dairy Science. I know this is a topic that's of interest to a lot of the audience, and I think it's an interesting one. I'm convinced that there's a lot of awesome research that's going on that gets unpublicized, not unpublished, but maybe underpublicized. So I'll start with a little outline of the webinar today. I'm going to start with an analogy of milkshakes and publishing research and how those two go together. I know they don't sound like they do, but I think at the end you'll get the point there. Give you a few examples of some cool research that has been published and how that research was discovered and turned into an article, and I'll be using examples from our publication, Progressive Dairyman magazine. And then give you some tips and suggestions of how to help get your research noticed, and then we'll go to a question and answer at that point. First, I wanted to start with this quote from the business world. There's a theory called jobs to be done theory, which has been promoted recently by Clayton Christensen, who's a Harvard business professor. And he said this: many products fail because companies develop them from the wrong perspective. Companies focus too much on what they want to sell their customers rather than what those customers really need. What's missing is empathy, a deep understanding of what problems customers are trying to solve, the job to be done. Now, I know this is used in a business context, but I think it has application in academics as well. And, for example, here with the image that I've shown, many of us might like some flavors of Jell-O, but this celery-flavored one was not a hit on the market. One of the things that Clayton Christensen talked about in his book, How Will You Measure Your Life, which I referenced in the previous slide, was some work that he did working for a client that was a fast food restaurant that was selling milkshakes. And they hired him and a firm to look at their milkshake sales and determine how could we increase the sales of our milkshakes. And the company had done all kinds of focus group research and looking at customer preferences for sweetness and sugar content and overall flavor, and all of those metrics that they had gathered and put into different recipes hadn't moved the needle on increasing milkshake sales. So when they hired Clayton Christensen and his group, they brought them in to do some observational research and see if that might be able to help show how to increase milkshake sales. And what Clayton Christensen and his group found was that there was two distinct customers of milkshakes, and they determined them by observing sales of milkshakes throughout the day. So they would show up at the fast food restaurant and observe the customers as they came in, and see what they purchased and what time they purchased and maybe how much they would spend on the milkshake. And what they found was the first customer was a morning commuter. They noticed that people would come in sometime between, say, 8 and 10 in the morning, and they would order a milkshake, and then they would pay and quickly leave the store and go on with their day. And after they had determined that this customer set that came in the morning, they approached some of them and asked them, well, why did you buy the milkshake? What was your enticement to purchase it? And they said, well, I'm on my way to work, or I'm taking my kids to school, and got a little bit of a long morning, and so I need something to keep my mouth busy. And then they asked them, well, what substitutes might you have used in the place of the milkshake? And the outcome was, well, I could have had a bagel, I guess, but bagel's kind of hard to eat in the car. It's kind of flavorless. You'd need to put cream cheese on it or something to make it flavorful, and that's not really easy to do in the car. Could have had a banana, but it doesn't really last very long. It's not very filling. And they went through a number of other food items that they could have purchased, but what they found was that the milkshake was kept them busy during the commute. It needed to be thick, something they had to suck through a straw, and that would take a long time to consume, keep them busy throughout that 20 to 30 minute commute, and also was filling and filling both from a appetite perspective, but also fulfilling in that it didn't seem like it was overly indulgent. One of the substitute foods was a donut, but that was perceived by commuters as not being healthy. So the second group was an afternoon customer, and they came in typically sometime after school hours between 2 and 4 p.m., and what they found was it was typically dads actually bringing in their kids, and they would purchase a milkshake for them and then stay in the restaurant to consume it. And so they approached these customers and said, well, why did you purchase that milkshake? And the dads would say, well, I've told my kids for the last week, you can't play Xbox today. No, you can't stay up late. No, you can't go outside and play. You need to do your homework first. And a milkshake was something that they could say yes to, and that it made them feel like they were a good parent, that they were providing something that their kid asked for and enjoyed, and that was meaningful. But the difference in the milkshake from the morning customer versus the afternoon customer was that it needed to be thin. It was being sucked through a straw again, but kids have a hard time sucking a thick milkshake through a straw, and if it took too long, the parents would end up throwing some of the milkshake away and leave as they hurried off to their other activities, ball practice or whatever the kids might be involved in. So what the research showed was that there was two distinct customers for this milkshake, and that the milkshake itself needed to be different. The morning milkshake needed to be thicker and harder to consume through a straw so that it would keep the morning commuter busy. And then the afternoon customer's milkshake needed to be thinner so that it could be sucked through the straw faster and consumed in the restaurant, and then the customer could leave. Now, what does this have to do with research that you might be doing? Well, I think that there's two types of research that are of interest to producers, and that's what we'll talk about today for the rest of the webinar. There's practical research, and then there is wonder research. So let's go ahead and start with an example of the practical research. This was some research that we published in our magazine last fall, and it's research from Penn State University. The design on the right over here is what our designers here at the magazine put together, and the text over here on the left is the summary of the research, and these photos came from the research group. Basically, in short, what the research was attempting to do was to show if any added flavors to a total mixed ration would increase the intake of dairy cows. And as we all know, if intake increases, it helps in a lot of different ways, including health and milk production. So here was the, kind of in a nutshell, this is the basic part of the research which showed the practicality of adding these flavors to a TMR. Researchers believed determining a cow's preferred flavors could be helpful if used to stimulate feed intake in sick cows or to entice cows to be milked in a robot. The basic idea would be to have the flavored food only in the robot to attract the cow to the robot, says Michael Harper, a PhD candidate and the lead author of the research. It is important not to desensitize the animal to the flavor, similar to when we eat too much of one food like French fries and then we want something else like a salad. Therefore, the attractive flavor would not be offered in the TMR, but only in the robot. So this is the summary of how one of the things that the researchers were trying to get at was this question of, well, how could we entice cows to consume feed at certain times in their lactation or in certain places, in this case a robot. Now, how was that discovered? Well, this research was published in, I believe it was the August issue of the Journal of Dairy Science, and these are just a copy of my notes from the interpretive summaries. The interpretive summaries are really important for me. That's typically how I am reading the Journal of Dairy Science. I'll print off the several pages of summaries there and read them and make any notes on them. And this one struck me as kind of interesting here. This is what it looked like on the page, and here's the close-up of it. It's just a short communication preference for flavored concentrate premixes in dairy cows. After that, this is kind of the timeline of how that article went about being published. So published in August of the Journal of Dairy Science. On August 1st, as soon as the issue had come out and I had gone through it, I emailed the corresponding author, and the same day the corresponding author responded and indicated a willingness to answer questions about the research. So the next day I sent him those questions, and the following day after that he indicated that the grad student who was the lead on the project would be answering, and I sent those off to the grad student, and on August 9th the grad student replied with the quote and a little bit of a summary, which you saw in the previous slides, as well as some photos from the research that kind of showed what they were doing during the research project. Then this was turned into a published piece in Progressive Dairyman on October the 1st. So within 2 weeks' time of the research coming out, there was some reporting done, and within 2 months' time after that, it was published in a trade publication. So that's an example of a practical article. Let's go forward to that other classification, I think, that exists out there, what I'll call a wonder article. This is an example of a Q&A that was done in 2012 with Dr. Wilfred Vanderdonk from the University of Illinois. And he was talking about some work he had done with a compound called nisin, which has application for use in the dairy industry. And so his research was being explained here through this Q&A. And I'll go to the next part here. This is the wonder part of the article, which appeared as a note at the end of the piece. So a commercial company, Immucell, had received the rights for using nisin in dairy cows, and had an intramammary infusion product that contained the intrabacterial peptide nisin, and it was currently under FDA review at the time. Commercial introduction of the product in the U.S. is subject to approval of the company's new animal drug application. The company has been the sponsor of the investigational NADA from 2001 through 2004, and from 2007 to 2000 present. Several key regulatory approval decisions about the potential product are expected this year. FDA's Center for Veterinary Medicine has granted the company a zero milk discard and meat withhold label claim that would permit use of its product in lactating cows and not require milk be withheld or treated animals to be sold for meat pending full NADA approval. The company asserts that it would be the first FDA-approved intramammary mastitis treatment product that has such claim. So part of Dr. Vanderdonk's research was in further exploring the methods of how this product worked, the compound worked inside of dairy cows. And so that was the wonder part to a producer is, well, what could this research potentially lead to? And in the case of this compound, a potential commercialized product with a zero milk discard or zero milk meat withhold is the potential or at least the landing spot in the commercial space for this compound. And that is the part of the research that creates the wonder for the audience. So let me give you just another example here. Let's go through first how this one came about. So this is Dr. Vanderdonk here and two of his graduate students at the time, and his university has a website where they include research news. So you can see here at the top tab here where you can drop down and see all of the recent news that they've published. And what they're basically doing is taking papers that have been published or work that's been published and writing a short summary of what that work is doing, and then publishing it on their university webpage. So, for example, here the lead paragraph says, foodborne diseases might soon have another warrior to contend with thanks to a new molecule discovered by chemists at the University of Illinois. The new antibiotic, an analog of the widely used food preservative nisin, also has potential to be a boon to the dairy industry as a treatment for bovine mastitis. So I'm subscribed to this feed, and as it came through, read the article and reached out to the University of Illinois News Bureau, requested an interview with Dr. Vanderdonk. I also actually reached out to him at the same time, but going through the News Bureau was helpful as they helped coordinate his schedule with mine for an interview. Let me give you one more example here of a wonder article, and hopefully that'll help explain a little bit about this category of what I think is of interest to producers in discussing research. So this is actually from a recent example from our February 25th issue, just a couple weeks ago. Call your attention to the cover line here. The shells of lobster, shrimp, and crab show promise as treatment for metritis and mastitis. And this article that was published was based on research that was published in the Journal of Dairy Science from some University of Florida researchers, and it was published in December of 2016. We went ahead and read that piece, and here's an example of kind of how the article came together. After reading it, I had several questions, which I passed along to a freelancer in this case and asked them to pursue an article that would answer those questions and help producers understand what might be from this research that they were working on. This is the final piece that was published. As you can see here, the summary and brief is University of Florida researchers are moving a potential non-antibiotic treatment for infections in dairy cattle closer towards commercialization. And the lead paragraph there says, faculty at the University of Florida are exploring an alternative treatment for infections from an unlikely source, crustaceans. The shells of lobster, shrimp, and crab are treated with an alkaline substance such as sodium hydroxide to produce chitosan, a fibrous sugar with a chemical structure similar to cellulose. Chitosan microparticles are then engineered through a chemical process developed by Kwang Cho, Casey Jung, an assistant professor of microbiology and food safety in the Emerging Pathogens Institute at the University of Florida. This is an example, again, of one of those type of wonder articles of what could be from research that's going on. It's in the middle of the process, obviously, as there's not a commercialized product that could be sold to dairy producers today. But the article was a snapshot of where research has been, the ongoing research, and some of the research that still needs to be done before a potential commercial product might ever appear on the market. But these type of stories from our experience and our surveys are of high interest to producers because they do perceive science as one of those areas that is interesting, fascinating, and specifically when they can see the potential wonder of research, that what it might produce in the future, that's of high interest to them. So I'd go ahead and kind of give a summary here of some tips, I guess you would say, some suggestions that I would provide or suggest for graduate students who are working that will help in getting your research noticed after it's been published or finished. The first one here is really important. Take pictures or think of any visuals that would illustrate your work. Now, I'm talking from a print media perspective because that's my background. I guess I'm personally a little biased. I think print media is the media that is maybe the best for publicizing research. One, because journalists there typically have what we would call in our field beat topics. They have areas of interest that they are to stay on top of, to keep abreast of new research and new information that's coming out, and so they're highly focused in specific areas which is a little bit different from other media's outlets such as video or maybe even radio. But there might be some instances where you do have some great visuals, even maybe opportunities for video production, where someone could come in and take video and add that to a story. Video journalists, broadcast journalists, typically aren't quite as deep dive as other media outlets, so they may or may not be interested in tackling research without a lot of it being spoon-fed to them. So one way to spoon-feed is to get your university or departmental communications involved. Usually those channels do exist in some way, but I would encourage those to be bolstered. That's kind of the bridge between an editor and a source. They help make sure that deadlines can be met and schedules can be coordinated, and that an interview might have priority for both the editor and for the source. It's also great. I showed you an example from the University of Illinois about if they are if you have someone who can write those articles for you, maybe they're comm students or some way to produce a summary of the work that's not necessarily in the same format as has been published in a journal. That can help get the word out there. I think another important thing, especially when you're working with colleagues, is to make sure that whoever is selected as the corresponding author is willing to really be the correspondent and also be prompt at correspondence. In some of these examples that I've shown you where I've followed up with researchers who were listed as the corresponding author in the Journal of Dairy Science, sometimes those authors aren't very prompt in their reply about questions that I have about the research. And so if someone's going to be the corresponding author, you want to make sure that they might know what would be expected of them. If someone did have a question, especially from a journalistic perspective, would they be willing to field those questions and prompt at correspondence? Next one, explain when you're talking to, if you get connected with a journalist, what they're going to be interested in is explain what you did, but maybe more importantly, what it means now or for the future. What did your research produce that was practical? That's that practical type of research that's of interest to producers. Or what might be, what is the wonder, what is the potential that you're pursuing with your research that might inspire them to think of the future. I would encourage, again, whether you have a communications department or not, to send out press releases about your work. I'm subscribed to the Journal of Dairy Science, but that's the only publication that I subscribe to, both from a cost perspective but also just a volume of information. I know that there's other journals out there where research that would be published that would be of interest to my audience is being published, but I don't have the time nor the resources to subscribe to all of them. So press releases are helpful in getting some of the most interesting research in front of an editor without them having to do some of the legwork that I described here with the Journal of Dairy Science. We talked a little bit about this last one here. Print media might be your most likely source to pick up your story or to write about your research. I would focus efforts on them. It seems like, for example, even some of the national outlets like NPR have food and agriculture-related blogs or segments. There are some other of those type of outlets out there. If you find the one that covers your space, and introduce yourself to them, or send some of your work along as it happens. They're always looking for stories. I'm always looking for stories, and it's likely to be picked up if you're interested in it being picked up. The last one I guess I would say is develop someone to develop relationships with editors. If that doesn't exist at your institution or in your group, it's really helpful to have someone who knows who the editors are and can help kind of prod things along if necessary. ADSA has done a great job. They have a media relations contact who helps me if I get stuck or if I'm not making progress in connecting with a researcher an institution directly, then I make sure to reach out to that individual, and they can usually help grease the wheels and make sure things get moving. So with that, that was the bulk of my prepared comments, but I'd be willing to take any question and answer at this point.
Someone asked about how does Progressive Dairyman source their articles?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So we use a number of different sources. We have editors who will do the research similar to like I've been talking about here, and whether they write that article themselves or potentially do the front-end research and then pass it off to a freelance writer. Both of those two sources, a staff writer or a freelance writer, would be used. Occasionally, we will also invite a guest author to write a piece for the publication, and so that would be possible. And I didn't have an example in this slideshow, but there would be the opportunity in the future sometimes to, if a researcher is willing to summarize their work and submit it as under their own byline, they would be willing to do. They would have the opportunity to do that. A lot of them are too busy to do that, so we probably likely pursue different sources. But those would be some of the ways that the articles are sourced.
Thank you. And same Justin is asking about how do they find new research or interest, like wonder stories. That's a good question. Yeah.
How to find new research? Oh yeah. So just a lot of work. Usually, it's reading through the published research. As much as I've encouraged today the importance of reaching out through press releases and those kind of things, that really doesn't happen all that often. So a lot of the work is done, as I kind of described today, through reading published works and then following up with the lead authors of that research and writing up a summary of that work. So, I guess following kind of journal table of contents, articles, reading those when they come out, trying to subscribe to a number of these institutions' blogs or research updates, and some other subscriptions feeds that I would subscribe to are some of those places where I'd learn about them.
Thank you. We have another question. What would you recommend for someone who's planning to graduate and start their own lab as a professor, researcher, who may not have a lab, website, or format for putting out press release?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's usually a lot of really interesting work that happens in those settings where a lab is an independent lab is created and there's research work going on there. I'll give you an example of one recently that we've worked with. Rock River Labs is one of the sources that provides both as a source and as well as bylined content to our publication. And they fit in that category of being kind of an independent lab. It's a commercial lab, but they do their own work, and they have enough volume of work that they can write on specific topics. And prior to that, I was again kind of communicating directly with the lead researcher at the lab, and that worked great. He was very interested in writing for our publication, submitting some guest articles, and providing us with some ideas. But his time was obviously very stretched between his research work as well as the business aspect of running the lab. And recently, within the last year or two, they did hire an individual to do marketing and some business things, but also communicate with the press, and that's been extremely helpful in facilitating more information exchange. So I understand that it's not always feasible immediately, but I think if you're interested in getting more information about the research that you're doing out there, you probably will have to invest some time and resources into a person or whether that's an actual staff person or whether it's a part-time freelance person who can do that coordination with the media.
Thank you, Mr. Cooley. We have another question saying, thank you for the presentation. How do you measure how your public like the articles or the topics you publish?
Yeah, so we do a number of different kind of metrics here internally. Probably the most common one is feedback about specific articles, so calls or questions for more information, requests for follow-up. Typically, those don't actually come to the magazine. They usually go to one of the sources. So I'm usually following up with sources of the articles or the byline authors of the articles and seeing what kind of feedback they were receiving about a particular piece. So that's a prominent one. We do an internal survey usually once a year, at least every other year, asking for what topics producers are interested in. They're interested in everything, but given a specific milk cycle, a milk price cycle, or maybe just the current dairy market environment, they might have more interest in one topic versus another. And so we poll them to see what is current on their mind, and then use those suggestions to create articles for the upcoming year. And then how do we find out the topics that they like to publish? Again, we're just talking to our sources. We also have some dairy producers on an advisory panel who give us direct feedback about particular topics.
Thank you, Mr. Cooley. I also have a question. I'm wondering, does any of these publications have any student columns where they can approach themselves, like maybe for an undergraduate student or for a graduate student may not be a very prominent research, but something interesting, maybe more like a literature review that they wanted to publish? Do they have an availability on any of these publications for the students?
Not sure I can speak about the other publications. I know in the case of Progressive Dairyman, we have had those contributors before. There was one there was a graduate student in Canada, and he did several of those literature reviews. So in other words, as he's writing papers or doing some background research, he would write one of those more practical articles, like here's what research has been done on hoof care and some of the best practices, what we know up to this point from research that's been done. And those articles were well received. So there would be that opportunity if a graduate student was interested in parlaying some of the work that they're doing for their academics potentially into a trade journal space or for some additional publicity.